Thank you for coming. Welcome. I'm finding this all very strange because normally I do this as part of a double act. I teach in conferences an awful lot with my wife, Fiona, and we bounce ideas off each other across the room, and it makes teaching very pleasurable to do that. She is unfortunately not with us today. She's had the misfortune of having to go to Chelsea Football Club to do some inset work with Kensington and Chelsea head teachers. I think I got the better gig, don't you? Absolutely. How many people in the room are SENCOs? Great. How many of you have submitted anything for publication in a journal? Right. But that's the talk then, done really. Because the question is, why not? That was a question. Time. How many of you have done the SENCO award? How many of you have done that fairly recently? And you wrote copious essays for that? Fairly lengthy pieces of essays? You did some small-scale research for it? Did you think about getting it published? Why is that? Time, of course. I absolutely agree with you that time is a hugely problematic issue for anybody working in schools with the pressures you have. I'm amazed you survive. I've never worked, well, I have worked for a year as a SENCO in preparation for somebody taking over the role. So I always had somebody with me shadowing what I was doing, and that was in 2000, 2001. So I fully understand that the pressures and the work that you have make it very hard to think beyond getting through the day, getting through the workload that you have. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later in the time that we have for discussion. But that's always the reason you don't do something, isn't it? And I want to try to persuade you this afternoon that we, the three journals that Nasen sponsor, that's you've got on your seats, I think. No, you haven't. But there are some handouts here that please take. Three journals sponsored by Nasen, published by Wiley, BJSE, which I edit with Fiona, Jawson, which is edited by David Armstrong. He's based in Australia, in fact, Flinders University. That's an online journal, so we have no copies of it. I do have a copy of BJSE here. I've put it down somewhere, and one of Support for Learning. Here we are. So that's what BJSE looks like, Support for Learning, similar house style. And Support for Learning, who is edited by Philip Garner from the University of Northampton, who was here earlier doing one of these sessions. I don't know if anybody went to that session. SFL is a practitioner journal. What Philip will publish is accounts of interventions, of practice, of what you're doing, the bread and butter stuff that you're doing. And he would love to hear from you about the work you're doing, about what you're doing, how you're meeting the needs of children, successful interventions, successful programs, written up into a form that can be published. We also publish some articles like that, but we focus on strategy pieces, think pieces, pieces around using theory to theorize practice. So in a minute we'll be talking about Kearns, 2005, an article written by Kearns in 2005, which was published in BJSE, which uses a typology for the role of the SENCO in 5 parts. And we'll look at that in a second. So again, if you have thoughts about how the role of the SENCO might evolve, rather than how it's actually being done now, we would be very interested in talking to you. Jawson does more theoretically based research pieces. It's more of an academically inclined journal in the sense of talking to the academic community rather than to the practitioner community, perhaps. So that's the journals. And we're always looking to publish material. And I think most of them have gone now. There were 2 articles that we had put here. There were some copies of. One that we've published in recent editions around the role of the SENCO. And I'm going to allude to one of those in a minute as well. So that's just a preamble about the journals and what it is we want to get from you if we can. So that fills in with that. I don't need to go on to that. And I put this up because these are the learning outcomes for the SENCO Award. And we've highlighted how often they mention research. If you go down that list, everyone has got something about research in it. And that might be taking an intervention and instead of just doing that intervention and having a gut reaction that it has worked, putting that into some systematic form, some framework around a piece of research that allows you afterwards to say, I know why that piece of worked. I'll give you an example. How many of you are familiar with the National Student Survey? None of you are. Why would you be? Do you remember as an undergraduate when you left university, you were asked to fill in a survey about how good the course had been, how satisfied you were with the course? That means yes, that means no. Yes, there's some of those going. The results were published last week, and my university has been working very hard to improve our NSS scores. And they've made the classical error of introducing 10 or 12 small interventions, small differences to try to improve the NSS scores. The scores have gone up, but now they don't know what it was that they did that made the scores go up. So they can't replicate it. They can't focus on what made them go up and do away with the things that didn't make it go up, if that's what they want to do. And I think that's what happens in school, isn't it? There's so many things happening. You do interventions, you have this, you have that, and afterwards you think, well, what was it? What was that crucial thing that made the difference, that improved the outcomes for the children that we're working with? So I think that's that systematizing that is there in all of those activities, but perhaps you don't get around to doing. So I'm going to explore a piece of work that we did, which was a theoretical piece of work. This was a piece of work that Fiona and I did. And we took the Kearns typology that talks about those 5 types of SENCO. Expert, rescue, collaborator, arbiter, and auditor. Thank you. That's the top one. And I think that's really quite an interesting... Now, how many of you recognise those? How many of you are auditors? How many of you are collaborators? How many of you see yourselves as rescue? We're taking the children who are on the margins, the children who are being marginalised, the children who are not succeeding, and it is our mission, it is our vision, it is our ethos, it is our desire in life to do something with those children at an individual level. Do any of you recognise that? Is that what you're doing? I'm struggling hard to warm you up. I love interaction, so if it is, how many of you see any of those? Can any of you recognise yourself in any of those roles?
I don't think you're necessarily only one of them either.
Right.
It's probably a mixture of those, depending on which group of children that you're working with or what school you're working in.
That was exactly what we wanted to find out. Thank you. Yeah. You didn't realise I'd placed that person in the audience too. So we took this typology, which we found interesting in itself, but we wanted to explore how it fitted together and whether it was a role that you did all of the time or whether it was a lot of different roles. So this is what we did. And we don't, I'm not going to go into any great detail with that. We used IPA. We did a series of Skype interviews with SENCO volunteers in the full range of schools, made contact through the SENCO award, through personal contacts, can I just say, I didn't say this at the beginning, Fiona works on programs connected to SEND, including the SENCO award at Edge Hill University. I work on a program that is a 4-year program, a unique program, we're very proud of it, and please tell it to everybody you know, that is a primary education course in SEND and inclusion with QTS. As far as we know, we're the only course in the country that links SEND inclusion with QTS. So we're not training special school teachers, we're training primary teachers who know about SEND and inclusion and have QTS. So we're familiar with the field and we make lots of contacts with people working in schools. So that was what we did. Semi-structured interviews done by Skype, talking about the Kearns typology. And the thing that we found, and this was what was really interesting about what you were saying, is that you can argue that the roles that Kearns talk about actually make up a nested hierarchy. That some people are simply rescuers. Some people are simply auditors. Or some people are rescuers and auditors. And if you look at all the roles, the way they're talking, you identify some SENCOs, and not many of them, who have superseded all of the roles and have become the pedagogical lead in their school. And when that has happened, it has been because they've been aligned with a head teacher who shares their vision. Now, one school in particular I can think of now, is there anybody from the Northwest here?
Yep.
Whereabouts?
Liverpool.
Oh, well, that's not the Northwest. That's almost Midlands, isn't it? No, this was a school in Morecambe, and a big school, big urban school. One of those schools that the government is now talking about being on the coastal fringe with a huge amount of deprivation in the school, a very challenging school, and 42 staff working in the school other than teachers. And they are the responsibility of the SENCO, and that includes everybody, direct responsibility for all of those staff, but who works absolutely closely aligned with the head teacher to drive the pedagogy in the school. And that is becoming an inclusive pedagogy. That is not about a department that is separate. It's mixed ability teaching all through the school. And one of the things that the SENCO talked about, and it was very poignant, she filled up. That was one that we did, I did face to face. She filled up. She was almost in tears because she was recounting a situation with a Year 6 child who had to be taken out of the class because they were focusing on SAT. And it was the first time this child had been taken out of the class. And the child had a totally ambivalent view. And you'll sympathise with this. He was pleased because he was going out, but he was also very sad because he was leaving his class. And we do that on a daily basis, don't we, with children? We take them out of the group, we separate them out. So what do we think of that? Do you think it is a nested hierarchy? Do you think we can reach a point where SENCOs are seen as the pedagogical lead in the school, particularly in the absence of head teachers who are pedagogical leads? How many of you work for a head teacher who is not a pedagogical lead, who sees their role as chief executive, who sees their role as manager, who's not really interested in teaching and learning? Anybody? We see that increasingly in schools. Managerial schools, often in MATs or academies, I'm sorry to say, where the focus of the senior management team is not really about pedagogy. So, any comments at that point? Does any of that make any sense to you? Do you recognise any of that? A nod. Go on. How? Why?
Well, what you were saying about academies and executive heads, you know, if they are spread over 2 or 3 schools, they can't have that. So somebody has to fill that gap.
So how many of you think you're a pedagogical lead? That you have a direct influence on what happens in the school in terms of teaching and learning for all students? Not just teaching and learning for the students that you work with? Yes, some hands going up. Tell us about it.
We're a reasonably small school, but I work extremely closely with my head teacher. She listens to things when I go in and say, I can agree and disagree, and I think that's one of the most powerful things. If I disagree, she'll listen, and as long as I can back up why I disagree, she'll follow through the policies that I think are best for all of our children. We've moved to mixed ability, and the difference across the whole school is amazing. I can understand why that teacher got so emotional like you said when she did, because if you compare it to 3 years ago to the way we had systems in place then, we have a high level of SEN in our school, a high level of VA out, and some teachers and some staff didn't think it was possible to do it, but we're all such a big team and working together now, and it's not just, oh, she's the SENCO, she's in charge of all the SEN. We're all working together to kind of...
You know what I'm going to do afterwards? I'm going to ask this young lady to write an article for us, because that sounds like a really good story. You looked a bit sceptical.
No, it's not, it's because we're not in school.
Ah, okay. So you're an area SENCO?
We're not, we're assessors for a qualification.
Okay. Okay, so this isn't making any sense to you?
It is, yeah.
Okay, sorry. Please, I'll try to adjust what I'm saying.
Not at all.
So, I'm now going to... I hate doing... I'm the world's worst planner when it comes to filling in a form, when it comes to filling in a lesson plan. How many of you enjoyed doing all those lesson plans when you were on placement? How many of you enjoy doing all those lesson plans now? Reams and reams and reams of paper. I'm very, very bad at them. And when I was asked to send in this PowerPoint 3 weeks ago, I put something together, and I'm not going to do half of the slides because it doesn't fit the mood of the room, it doesn't fit the group. What about that last point? We have a raft of middle managers. Did any of you go to Bram Norwich's talk earlier on today? Bram is a professor at Exeter, widely written in the field, and he talks about connective specialisations. Middle managers in schools, there are many roles that middle managers do, say the maths lead or the literacy lead in a school, that are not dissimilar to the sorts of roles that you might do. there may be a clash. You may be doing the same things with some children that they're doing with the majority of children. So why have you? Why not get rid of you and get them to do the role for all children?
I think perhaps does that work better in a primary setting, where I think primary teachers on the whole tend to be teachers of children, don't they? Whereas maybe secondary school teachers are teachers of their subject. So does that make a greater need for a SENCO coordinator where you have perhaps a teacher who might only be seeing that student perhaps once in a week, 2 or 3 times.
But how does that fit in with the code of practice that says that...
Every teacher's a teacher of SENCO.
And indeed, that the class teacher should be doing the annual report on the child or the regular reports on the child. But how often does that devolve to the SENCO? So in having a SENCO, do you create a bin, a waste pit bin, whatever you want to have, whatever analogy you want to use, where they can dump all that work onto you, because then they don't have to do it?
But if you're that pedagogical lead, then it's teamwork, isn't it, rather than just something.
Well, I think that's the counterbalance to what I'm saying, because we found SENCOs in our research who still saw their role and still enacted their role in a compliance sense. They were meeting the requirements of the code of practice, they were meeting the policies of the school, but weren't going beyond that. So it was a very narrow interpretation of the role. All their paperwork was up to date, everything was tickety-boo from that point of view, but it didn't go beyond that, really. And it was very much a compliance-led one. And sorry, I've put down the clicker now. You see, you shouldn't give me toys to play with. You should not give me toys to play with. What am I doing to it? Because the second piece of work that we want to draw attention to, which is the work by Helen Curran, which we published in BGSE quite recently, which was she's doing a lot of work on the role of the SENCO. It's a 5-part study, but this was just reporting one part of it. And she was using this typology from Ball, Stephen Ball. Are you familiar with him? Sociologist, very well known in the field, about how the code of practice was being enacted in schools. And she found that there was some linkage with that typology, that some SENCOs were enacting the code of practice and the changes that came from the code of practice by selecting and narrating change. They grabbed hold of bits, and even if they didn't have a position in the senior leadership team or a position that could influence policy, they were driving change through on the basis of, well, it's in the code, we've got to do it. So they were interpreting. They were narrating they were implementing the narrative of the code of practice within their schools. And you go down the typology again, and you can see how that was fitted to some people. But the one that worry me is the receiver, because that was very much like one of the categories in the Kearns typology: compliance, rigid adherence to the code of practice. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but is that what all the role is? Just doing what you're supposed to be doing in the code of practice? Or is it more than that? And that's why we're interested in the influence, as you said, the notion that every teacher is a teacher of all children, which we don't see in many schools. Now, I've talked a lot, and I'm conscious of time. I mean, it's already 20 past, and I do tend to rabbitt on. And I do want to get some feedback. Last year, people were really hitting me with what the complexity of their jobs were, and how all this was airy-fairy and pie in the sky. And we really haven't got time to do any of this, because we haven't got time to do our job. But can we help you? Because we can shape policy. We have influence. People read the journals. People in power read the journals. But we need you to feed us those good news stories. We need you to sit in your work and think about how your role is developing, how it could develop, and get that to us. And we will work with you. We don't need completed manuscripts. We need a good attempt at a completed manuscript, but we're quite happy to help you develop that, to get it ready for publication. And my fellow editors would say that. And Nasen is becoming increasingly powerful. You can see that today. You can see the links that Adam Boddenson is driving forward with the DFE. And we can help to shape that agenda by using the journals. So it's a way of you contributing to the field in a broader sense than your everyday work. Shut up, Graham. Does anybody have anything they want to say about any of this? Or is it too jumbled? Have I just thrown stuff at you without really giving you a clear picture? Please, if you're not being controversial, I don't want to hear from you.
Well, it's really interesting that you talked about SENCOs, but from a school perspective, and we've got some colleagues in the room, and I am one included, who has just finished teaching the Early Years SENCO award. And I would say that as those SENCOs, that they feel very unimportant in their roles in private, voluntary and independent sector. And they actually almost don't feel as important as other SENCOs from school. And they're made to feel like that quite often. And the fact that you haven't talked about them, and actually they haven't been mentioned that much today, has strengthened the fact that that's what they feel.
Mea culpa. No. Yeah, see, look. I think you make an absolutely valid point, and I take it away. I internalise it. I mean, we wouldn't. See, you know what I'm going to say now. Write us the article, and we'll publish it. Yeah, I think it's a valid point. I am astonished that we have not lost the requirement that the SENCO is a qualified teacher. I'm amazed that hasn't been stripped out with all the other things that have gone. So there are some things that remain, and I take the point. I mean, I think the whole early years area is one that is, but also the growth in independent special schools or units or whatever alternative provision, which is astronomical, and I'm not sure about what's happening there either, and how that's being enacted. I'm not sure in terms of maths, for example. I mean, that is one that really interests me. There was a case in Manchester recently. It wasn't actually Manchester local authority, it was in the city of Manchester, I think it was Trafford, a MAT, where the children thought they were going to one school, but just before they went, they found they were going to a different school, because the school was putting all its bad eggs into one basket, if you want me to be blunt. So there's all sorts of processes out there that are happening that we need to be aware of. And we can't do that all. You know, the academic community can't do it, because we have the similar sorts of stress you do. Getting my colleagues to research is very, very hard to do. So that was the message I wanted to get out. You know, the big message today, whether it's about the role of the SENCO, whether it's about anything else, is, you know, you've got a voice, you've got something to say. Please say it to us. Please give us the chance of publishing it. We'd love to hear from you. And I don't know why there is that difficulty in getting people to do the research. I imagine every one of you is a practitioner action researcher. I don't believe there's anybody in this room who isn't a practitioner action researcher. You recognise the need in a child, you decide to put something in place to tackle that issue, and then you review it at the end to see whether it was worthwhile. Is there anybody who doesn't do that in their work every day of the year? And yet you don't write it up. You don't turn it into a piece of writing that we can put out. And that was my message today in all of this, was how can we help you with the Nasen journals to get that message out, to promote you doing that. So if I get 2 people today who come up to me afterwards and say, we'd like to talk to you about writing something, that would be a success for me. But it shouldn't be a success. I've been in teaching a long time. You can see, can't you? I'm battered and worn. I'm only 35, actually, no. I qualified as a teacher in 1971. That is horrible, isn't it, when you work that out? And I'm still serving the sentence. I must have done something terribly wrong. When I was training, one of the books that I read was the book by Lawrence Stenhouse. Does Lawrence Stenhouse's name mean anything to this audience? It won't do. The school humanities project, he was instrumental in setting that up and running it. It was an amazing piece of work given when it was done. Inquiry-based learning in the 1970s and 80s. I mean, that's quite astonishing, isn't it? But he has a chapter in one of his books, The Teacher as a Researcher. And he says in that chapter, the best researchers are teachers. You're the ones in the classrooms. You're the ones who have that knowledge, that intimate knowledge, that daily knowledge. And you're doing it anyway. So why doesn't that translate into the bigger academic community? You were controversial. I said mea culpa, because you're absolutely right. Does anybody else want to be controversial? Does anybody else want to say anything? If not, we can all go home and catch our trains home. I'm sorry it's been very amorphous, and I mean, I had this section on discussion, but you know, that, sorry, I've got to go a bit, yeah, I've got to go further back. That last one, I think, is the counterpoint to the one that it's a nested hierarchy. How many of you are members of the senior leadership team? That's not many. It's 20% of the room, maybe less. And yet it says specifically that the SENCO should be a member of the senior leadership team. Why isn't that happening? Why isn't the role becoming a role that is absolutely integral and fundamental to what's going on in the school? Or are you simply that person who can be relied on? How many of you teach in a well-equipped, well-sorted-out classroom when you're doing your SEND work? How many of your people, when they do interventions, are in the cloakroom? Or tucked in a corridor? Sorry?
In a corridor.
In a corridor. Because that's how much we're valued, isn't it? Often. How much our work is valued. See, I'm now getting into my vision thing. 19% of children who leave school at 16 do not meet the government benchmark of 5 GCSEs at a good grade. 19%, 1 in 5. 10% leave with nothing. 9%, I think, to be truthful. 15,000 children are off-rolled every year. The number of exclusions has gone up 50% in the last couple of years. We've now reached a stage where there are more children with statements, strokes, EHCPs in special schools than in mainstream. That's the first time in the last 15 years that's been reached. Were you aware of that? There were always, for the last 15 years, there have been more children with statements, EHCPs in mainstream schools than the other way around. This year, the figure is reversed. The number of children with statements, EHCPs in mainstream schools is steadily declining. Why?
Funding. I think the lack of funding, I sat in the earlier one around numbers and changing numbers, and I just think that if you related that to the amount of funding that schools get, that has gone down over that time, and the number of children that...
Can I ask you a question? You're SENCO?
I used to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your school budget for SEND?
It was...
Can you tell me precisely what it was?
It was a special school.
Okay. Again, touche. But how many of you as SENCOs in mainstream schools can tell me what your SEND budget is?
Well, if you're in a math, it's very woolly, because they'll say, well, you would get this in as the math, and then your school kind of gets, and then they're a bit woolly about it.
10 years ago, the SEND funding for a school was a separate line in the school budget. You could look at and you could see it. Now it's just in the general amount. It's just thrown in as part of the general amount. How many of you know? Could anybody now tell me what the SEND budget is for their school? Specifically.
I'm not a SENCO, but I'm the SEN governor, and I know it was 244.
Right, so you know exactly what your school had. But look at the rest of the room. Nobody else is agreeing that. So
SENCO does now.
how can we possibly do our job? How can you do your job if you're guessing what your funding is? And what happens to the funding? I mean, I'm not saying that funding is generous. Please don't get me wrong. But you look at what actually goes into schools and how it is divided up. The same with pupil premium. You know, can we be certain that pupil premium is used for the benefit of the children for whom it's intended? And I don't think we can. Go on.
There's more accountability for people because they have to really know with them reports with SEN things, isn't it?
So you're actually doing your job with your hands tied. You don't know what funding you have got, what needs you can meet. Okay. Have I said anything that's been of any use? Probably not. But please take one of these. Take one of these flyers. Think of the journals. How many of you read the journals? How many of your schools are members of great. Do you read the editorials? Do you? Oh, great. we write them every 4 months and we put them out there and think, does anybody actually ever read these things? So it's great to hear that some of you do read them. You can get them as an app now, I believe. I don't understand apps. But I think gather the things you put on your mobile phones, and you can. So they are available as apps. School membership, is a way around them. Lots of schools used to. I don't. They still do have a corporate membership of Nasen, so they get the journals. Because getting the journals, we now only print. Although we're still a print journal, we only print now about 200 copies. Every 3 months, 4 times a year. Most of our readers read the journal online, and we'd love feedback. You don't have to write an article. Just give us some feedback on our articles. We frequently ask for that feedback. We ask for the feedback on editorials. Give us the feedback. We'll print it. Jill Richards, who was here earlier on, sorry, I'll come to you in a second. Jill Richards, who was sitting there, I can imagine her still standing there, even though she isn't there. These are her posters from the work she does on the SENCO award. She's our book review editor. Do any of you want to review a book? An SEND book, you'll get a free copy of it. Because we publish extended book reviews in every edition, and we try to get one from an academic and one from a practitioner. so that we get both sides of the coin. So put your name forward to Jill. She would love to have you. That's a way of getting into doing some writing for the journals. So there's lots of ways of doing it. Give us feedback. How many of you are on the SENCO forum? How many of you know of the SENCO forum? That worries me. Does nobody in the room know about the SENCO forum? One person. National SENCO forum. Used to be curated by Klaus Waddell. It's now curated by Christopher Robertson at the University of Birmingham, I think. Every edition we have a report from the SENCO SENCO forum, and it's, you know, join it. The SEN policy review. There's a group called the SEN policy group. They meet 3 or 4 times a year in London. Go down to that and influence policy. They'd love to hear from you, because otherwise it just becomes academics talking to academics, and we need the practitioner voice. So please be involved. Please think about what you can do and how you can use the journals. So not just in the sense of reading them and thinking about what they say, but contributing to them, either through talking about practitioner research or talking about theory and how it impacts on your work. Take a model, see how it looks in terms of your work. Or get in contact with us and do some joint research. We're always looking to do joint research with people. If you want us to come and do some joint research with you, we'd be very happy to do it.